Hello everyone and welcome to another Blender Made Easy tutorial. Today we're going to be creating this building particle effect. Now I do want to give credit to Mike Mo for the idea. This simulation that you see on screen was done in Houdini and I wanted to see if I can do something similar in Blender. There are a lot of topics that we're going to be discussing in this video, so let's go ahead and get started. Firstly, we don't need the default cube, so go ahead and delete it. And next, let's add in the model that we're going to use. Now you can use any model that you want, but you want to make sure of one thing, that the entire model is one object and it's all connected, or you're going to have some problems with the Boolean modifiers later. If you want to use the same model I'm using, you can find it in the description. It's on TurboSquid. Once you have it downloaded, you can import an FBX file, navigate to where it's at, select it, and then import it into your scene. There we go, we can see it. And one thing that we need to change though is on the bottom right here, you can see there is no faces. So I'm just gonna go into edit mode with this object selected, holding the Alt key, I'm gonna select that ring and press F to fill in a face. I'll do the same thing for the other side. Next, there is a lot of geometry. We don't need this much geometry, so let's go ahead and add in a decimate modifier over in the modifier tab. Set the ratio down to 0.15, and then we can apply this modifier. Next, you can add in a solidify modifier. This will make the inside of our object hollow. I'll set the offset up to 1, and just bring up the thickness just slightly. Something like that will look good. Then we can go ahead and apply that. Now that we have our object in place, we are ready to work on the Boolean effect. And to achieve this, we're going to use geometry nodes. So press Shift A, let's add in a new cube object. This is just going to be the object for our geometry node system. If we split this view by taking the top left corner and dragging out, we'll switch it over to geometry nodes and then add in a new system. We don't need this input, so go ahead and disconnect that. And then I'm going to press Shift A and add in a volume cube object. So let's search in volume cube, and then we'll place it right here. Take the volume and plug it into the geometry. Currently, it's in the wrong position. We want it to encapsulate this whole model. So let's add in a transform geometry. We'll place that here, and then just drag it up just slightly along the Z. And then we can scale it down as well. Drag this down a little bit, drag the Y down. If we go into side view, we can drag the Y down until it matches right about there. That looks good to me. Next, we need to convert this back over to a mesh object. So let's press Shift A and type in volume to mesh, and we can see it right there. And if we place this here, now we have a mesh object, which is really nice. Now to get it to actually do that disintegration effect, we're going to apply a texture to the volume cube. The texture that you can use is a noise texture, a Verane, any kind of texture that you want to get the look that you're going for, but I found that a Verane texture looks pretty good. If we take the distance, plug it into the volume cube, we can then control this a bit better with a color ramp node. So let's search for color ramp and then place it in between. If we take this color ramp, you can see this is the effect that we're getting. It's starting to disintegrate, and this is how it's going to work with the Boolean modifier. Firstly, the size and everything is too big, so let's switch this over to 4D. We'll set the scale down to 1, and now if we drag this up, we can see this is the effect that we get. Now to see this a bit better, we can select our tree object and then add in the Boolean modifier. And then make sure you switch it over to fast, because sometimes the Boolean glitches when it's on the exact, so fast seems to work just a bit better. And then for the object, it's going to be this cube object. Now let's select it, hide it by pressing H, and we can see how the build effect is going to work. So if we drag this way, here is what it's going to look like. And if you like how that looks, then we can go on to the next step. Or if you want to change the texture, you can switch the W slider right here. So play around with this W slider and then play around with the color ramp until you find an animation that looks good. So after playing around, I found that a W of 1.1 looks pretty good. I like how this looks with the color ramp. It starts to build on the top right, and then it slowly appears on the bottom, and then a little bit right there, and I think that looks pretty good. So the next step is to animate this value. So what we'll do is we'll drag this way until it fully disappears, right about there. We'll press I while hovering over the position with the left handle selected. So over the position, hit I. We're going to jump all the way over to frame 220, drag this way until the entire thing is filled up. And we can see it's still a little bit right there, so drag it a little bit more until the entire model is completely full. That looks good to me. And then add in one more keyframe. So now that we have the geometry nodes set up correct, we can work on the dynamic paint. So select your object and then jump over to the physics panel. We can go ahead and move this over. We'll jump to the physics panel and add dynamic paint. There are two different dynamic paint simulations that we're going to add, and the first one is going to be an image sequence. This is going to give us that really cool ring along where it's building on our model. So for the format, switch it over to image sequence, and for the resolution, let's go up to 1024. Make sure dry is turned off and dissolve is turned on, and for the time, we're going to go down to 10 frames. In the output tab, you're going to want to set a cache folder of where all of your images are going to go. So click on the folder on the right and then create a new one. Once you have your folder selected, come down to accept. And the other thing that we need to do is create a UV map. So what we'll do is we'll go into edit mode with our model, select everything, hit U and go Smart UV Project, then hit OK. For the UV map, select it in the drop-down menu. Now for the brush object, that's going to be our cube right here. So select it, we can unhide it. And now for the dynamic paint, select it. And this time we're going to switch it over to the brush. Then click Add Brush. For the source, we need to switch it over to proximity. This will give us a slight distance. And the distance slider right here, we're going to set down to 0.05. If you want a bigger ring, you can set this even higher to like something like 0.1. But if you like how small the ring is in the video, you can leave it at 0.5. Two more very important things before we bake in our image sequence is we need to select our object right here and then select the geometry nodes modifier to bring back all of our nodes. Over in the resolution, we need to bring this up. We're going to set this to 128. And then also make sure you select your object and then hide the Boolean modifier. That is very important or the image sequence will not work. So make sure that is hidden. Then over in our physics panel, we can bake this in. Make sure you also save your project just in case this crashes. And then with that done, we can go ahead and bake this in. And if you did it correctly, you should see all of these sort of images in your folder. And now to test to see if this is actually working, let's come over here and switch it over to the shader editor, and then we'll add in those images. Now with this model, I think there are some default materials, so go ahead and delete both of those, and then add in a new material. Press Shift A, let's add in a image texture, we'll place it right here, and then click Open. And then with your image sequences, go ahead and press A to select everything, and also make sure that the paint map 001 is the first one. If for some reason it is 250, you can come over here and select the Sort by Name option. Then click on Open Image. This will turn it into an image sequence. Make sure auto refresh is turned on. Then what we can do is press Shift A, add in a converter color ramp to control this a bit better. And instead of taking the color, we're going to take the alpha and plug it into the color ramp. Then we'll take that and plug it into a math node. Take the color, plug it into the top input, switch it over to multiply, and then we're going to take the value and plug it into the emission strength. For the value right here, this controls how bright it's going to be. Let's set it over to around 10. And then for the emission color, let's just go with a orange yellowish color, something like this. Right about there looks pretty good. What we can do now is re-enable the Boolean modifier. So with your tree selected, head over to the modifier tab and then re-enable it. Let's jump over to frame like 80 or so. And then we're going to press H to hide our cube object. And then if we press Z and go into rendered view, we should be able to see it, and you can see it is working. Right where the edge is, that's where the glowing effect is. If you want to control this a bit better, you can take the color ramp, drag this way just slightly to clamp down on that edge. And I think that looks pretty nice. With that done, we are ready to work on the next dynamic paint simulation. So over in the physics tab, we're going to create a new one by hitting that plus sign. This time we're going to leave the format on vertex, and then for the surface type, we're going to switch it over to weight. This is going to create where the particles are going to emit on our object using a weight paint group. We don't need dissolve, so we can leave that there. And then for the output, make sure you select that little plus sign right there to create a new group. As for the brush object, we can go ahead and unhide this to make sure that it works properly. Everything is right here. We don't really need to change anything else. But before we bake this in, let's also create the particle system. So with our tree selected, let's jump over to the particle system tab and create a new one. For the number of particles, we're going to go all the way up to 300,000. For the start frame, it's going to be exactly where the mesh starts to appear. So let's jump over to frame like 5 or so, and we can see there is a little bit of a mesh right there. Maybe we can go back to frame 5, frame 4. Right about there looks pretty good. So for the start frame, let's switch it over to 4. And then for the end frame, let's jump all the way over to frame 200 and we'll see if the mesh is fully complete. You can see there it is still touching, so let's jump over to frame like 205 or so. And I think that is where it's fully complete. So for the end frame, we're going to switch it over to 205. The lifetime, this is how long the particles are going to last. Let's go with a value of 35. And if you want them to last longer, you can add that up. Then we'll give it some randomness by setting it 2.5. Another very important step is in the source value, make sure the use modifier stack is enabled. This will make sure that it actually works correctly with the Boolean modifier. Over in the velocity tab, we're going to set the normal amount to 0.5. This will make sure that the particles have a little bit of velocity in the direction of the normals. And then for the randomize, let's go up to 0.1 as well. In the physics panel, there are a couple of things that we need to change. The dampening value here, we're going to go to 0.2 because I found that the particles move quite fast. And then for the time step, this is the speed of the particle simulation as well. We're going to go down to 0.01. For the render, we're going to render this as an icosphere. So let's press Shift A and add that in. And then over here in this menu, we're going to switch the subdivisions down to a value of 1. Drag it over this way and scale it down. Make sure you also apply the scale by hitting Ctrl A and applying that scale. For the render as, switch it over to object, and then of course for the instant object, select the icosphere that we just added. If we zoom in, we can see that the size is quite big, so let's bring this down to 0.02. We'll see what that looks like. That's still a little bit too big, so let's go even smaller, 0.01, and then for the scale randomness, let's go down to 0.2. Finally, in the vertex group, we're going to select the density to be that group that we just added, dp_weight. And this will make sure that the particles only appear where the weight paint is. If you want to, you can set the proximity of our brush a little bit lower because it looks like the particles are emitting right here, which I might do. So jumping over to the physics tab, I might set the distance of the proximity. Let's go down to 0.02. This will make sure that the particles are a little bit closer to the object. And one more thing before we bake this in, we need to add in a ground plane for the particles to land on. So press Shift A, we'll add in a plane object. And let's make sure that the tree is actually in the right position. So I'll zoom in here. We can see it's slightly higher, so let's drag that down a little bit. And then scale this plane up. This is going to be our collision for the particles. Then we'll jump over to the physics panel, enable collision. And then for all of these values right here, let's just go up to 0.6 for all of them. The dampening is for the bounciness of the particles, and the friction is for how sticky it will be. And I found that 0.6 works pretty well. So with that done, we are ready to bake this in. Select your tree object, head over to the particle system, and then click on Bake All Dynamics. This will bake in the particle system, and it'll bake in the weight paint. So once that is done, we will take a look at it and then finish out the rest of our scene. Alright, everything is working correctly. You can see the particles are emitting where they are supposed to, and it is looking really good. With that being done, we can go ahead and select our object right here. We can hide it from the view and hide it from the render. One more thing I want to do to this particle system is have the particle shrink as it ages. We can do this very easily by adding in a texture. So over in the particle system, we're going to scroll all the way down to the textures and then create a new one. If we jump over to the texture panel, we can switch it from image or movie down to blend. And as for the influence, we're not going to influence the time, we're going to influence the size. So make sure time is turned off and size is enabled. As for the mapping, we don't want generated, we want strand particle. This is the age of the lifetime. Now you can see it's still not really working, and that's because we need to enable the color ramp down here, and then we need to flip this color ramp because currently it starts out really small and then grows. So we need to flip this so that the black is on the right side, and now you can see this is actually working. Then with this color ramp, I'm going to drag the white value much closer to the black value. So instead of shrinking over its entire life, it's going to remain the same size for about 70%, and then those extra frames, then it's going to shrink down to a value of 0. Now we can work on the material, so select your particle object. We're going to create a new material, and then we're going to delete this principled shader. We're not going to need that, and then we'll add in a emission shader. Take the emission, plug it into the material output. And as for this material, I want the color to change as it ages. We can control this using a particle info node. There are two options here, the age and the lifetime. One thing about this particle info node though is that it only works in cycles. Eevee does not support this node. So if you don't want to use cycles, go ahead and skip this part and just add in a color in the emission shader. But if you do, then go ahead and switch over to the cycles render engine. How this is going to work is we're going to add in a math node. We're going to take the age and the lifetime, add those into the bottom and top input, and switch it over to divide. Then if we add in a color ramp, we can now control the color. Take the value, plug it into the bottom input, and then the color is going to go into the emission color. The left side of the color ramp controls the beginning of the particle, and then the right side is where it ends. So for the left, we're going to use the same color that we did for the tree object. So select your tree object, and then for this color, just hover over it, hit Ctrl+C to copy, select your icosphere, and then paste that right here, hitting Ctrl+V. For the right side, we're going to switch this over to a red color, something like that. And then for the strength, we're going to set this up to a value of 10 to match the tree. Now, if we press Z and go into rendered view, you can see this is working properly. And with that being done, we can render this out into an animation, but if you want to go the extra step, we're going to create a smoke simulation. So what I'll do first is add in a cube object. This is going to be our domain. I'll go into front view, drag this up, and then place it right at the correct position. Scale it along the X. Something like this will work pretty well. Over in the physics panel, we're going to enable fluid, set the type over to domain object. For the resolution divisions, we're going to go up to 128. We don't really need to go too high because it's not going to be that visible. Over here, we're going to enable the bottom border collision. So if smoke gets emitted, it's going to hit the bottom. Turn on adaptive domain. And then for the threshold, we want to make sure this value is very low. We're going to enable dissolve. And then for the time, we're going to set it up to a value of 20. Make sure this is also set over to modular so we can bake it in, and then is resumable just in case we want to stop the bake. As for the flow object, it's going to be our tree. Make sure dynamic paint is closed off and then enable fluid, set the type over to flow. And then for the flow behavior, we're going to switch it over to inflow. And then the vertex group, select the dp_weight, and this will emit smoke only where the particles are. We're going to enable initial velocity and set the normal up to a value of 2. So this will make sure that the smoke gets emitted slightly in the direction of the particles. And that is basically all we really need to do for our smoke simulation. If you want to add in some noise, you can, but I found it doesn't look as good. Also, the vorticity, let's go up to 0.1 to give it a little bit more randomness. With that done, we are ready to bake this in. So over in the settings right here, all we're going to need to do is click on bake. Again, make sure you save your project before you do this. And once this is done, we'll render it out. One last material that we need to create is for the smoke material. Select your domain, click new, and go ahead and delete the principled shader. We're not going to need that. And then add in a shader and then a principled volume shader. Take the volume, plug it into the volume of the material output, and then we'll set the density up to around 5 or so. If we press Z and go into rendered view, we can see the smoke right there. If you want it to be more dense, you can set it up, which I might do. Let's go up to 15. And I think that looks pretty good. At this point, we are ready to set up the lighting and render it out. For the lighting, I set the world settings all the way down to black, And then for the default lamp that is in the scene, I switched it over to a spot lamp. I set the blend all the way up to 1, and then I brought the size down and then rotated it into place. So right about there, bring the size down a little bit. And if we press Z and go into rendered view, we can see exactly what it looks like. That looks pretty good. If you want to, you can also add in another lamp behind this lamp to give it some sort of rim lighting. So if we switch it over to a point lamp, we can set it to around 100 strength, probably around there or so. If we go into front view once again, press Z and go into rendered view, we can see what that looks like. And I do like how that looks. So at this point, we can set up the camera. I'm gonna go into front view, hit Control, Alt, and numpad 0 to snap the camera into place. Rotate it up a little bit, drag it backwards, and just place it right about here. Over in the render settings in the color management tab, we're going to set the look to high contrast. This will make sure that the colors pop just a bit more. And if you want to, you can add in some glare. So I'm going to render this frame out and then add in some glare in the compositor. To get over to the compositor, just exit out of this window and jump over to the compositing workspace. Right here we have our render layer, and if we want to see what this looks like, we can press Ctrl Shift and left click to add in a viewer node. And then we can shift right click over those two lines to add in a connector point. If we then add in a filter and then a glare node, we can place that here, switch it over to fog glow, and there we go, we now have some glow on our scene. If you think it is too much, you can bring the mix down just slightly to a negative value, and then something like that will look pretty good. At this point, we are ready to render. So go ahead, render this into an animation, and you are good to go. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial, and if you learned something new or created something cool yourself, send it to me on Instagram at BlenderMadeEasy. If you have other ideas for tutorials you would like to see in the future, let me know in the comments down below, and subscribe if you are new. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.